A critical dimension of how we support decentralization and local governance reform is the framework that we use to assess what is an appropriate kind of intervention. And there's an awful lot of standardization and orthodoxy in the way that we approach this. Everybody says context matters, but then in the end, we're often falling back on basic principles and trying to replicate what was done somewhere else, or trying to put into place a specific product or process that a particular development partner wants to sell. And I think it's really important to take a step back from the analytical frameworks that we've often used and to be a bit more flexible and nuanced and really assess the climate before a decentralization support project is defined. And a very concrete example of this is what's happened over a period of, well, nearly 20 years now in Cambodia. After the peace accords in the early 1990s in Cambodia, the donors came in full force, and the UN was already heavily involved and had a lot of credibility because of its role in brokering the peace accords, and it began providing a lot of assistance. And most of this was had nothing to do with decentralization or governance. This is a poor, very poor post-conflict country in an environment where you had a very dominant political party that was driving everything. It hardly seemed like an environment that was conducive to decentralization. Yet Cambodia ended up with a rather interesting experiment in decentralization. And this happened in part because of some donor experience with participatory mechanisms in allocating resources at the local level that was so successful in engaging people and developing many local development projects that the state had no capacity to develop, that the national government seized on it and developed and created a system of elected local governments that more or less coincided with this donor project. And it was very interesting experiment in a number of ways. First, the fact that government in a close to one-party state, it's not quite correct to say at that point in time, but there was clearly a dominance of one political group, and there was not a particular inclination to democratic local governance. But because of the role that this was playing with the development of these projects, because of the potentiality for creating credibility with citizens, the governments decided to create these local governments at the commune level. Now, it began to work rather quickly at a very basic level because of the foundation that the donor project had created. But it's very important to emphasize that it violated some of the traditional norms that we normally think about in decentralization. So, for example, in fiscal decentralization, one of the basic principles is finance follows function, that you first allocate specific functions to local governments and then you give them the resources to do those things. Now, that's correct if the most important objective is to deliver services. But in a case like Cambodia, the most important objective was to develop political credibility, and that meant getting resources down to these commune levels. And the problem, of course, is that you want the resources to be spent well. And since the donors had spent quite a lot of time developing the basic systems of planning and budgeting and citizen engagement and monitoring and so forth, there were systems in place already that guided the way that these resources were being spent. It was also a small percentage of the national budget, so it didn't threaten the power of central government ministries. By starting at a very small level, in a system where you already had some very basic management and accountability mechanisms, it was really able to take root in a way that I think few would have suspected in this environment that would normally be considered hostile for decentralization. Now, have there been issues with this? Sure. Are there issues about how it gets scaled up beyond the basics of a small program that gave unconditional grants that allowed citizens to make decisions with elected local councils about how to spend resources? There are some issues, but the bottom line is that this was even in this environment, the mechanisms were tailored to this context, and they were framed in a way that allowed an element of decentralization to take root. There's a couple of lessons from this experience. One is that sometimes there's an element of luck in this, how certain forces that you wouldn't expect to be conducive allow you to be able to do things. But it's precisely the role of the development partners who are trying to support mechanisms to look for those openings and to try to use them productively. The second big lesson, I think, is that maybe you can't always follow the orthodoxy. You shouldn't always follow the orthodoxy. The orthodoxy is designed, the orthodox view of decentralization is tied to the delivery of better services and promoting development and so forth. But in some cases where there may be it may be impossible to do this because of the weaknesses and so forth, the priorities may be different. In this case, building political credibility. And the way that in this case they built political credibility was by providing unconditional transfers, not mandating specific functions that had to be done, and letting citizens make their own mistakes and eventually learn to produce better projects. I think a third element here is the importance of bringing the various aspects of decentralization together, even if at a very low level. So in this, you had elections, you had political decentralization, you had administrative decentralization because the systems for budgeting and planning and so forth had been built, and you had fiscal decentralization in the form of an intergovernmental transfer. This is very different from some of the situations where you see one or the other of these elements emphasized, but not all of them together. And this is an example of a case in which even at this basic level in this hostile environment, you were able to bring the elements together in a way that was productive. And the other point I wanted to make about this case is has to do with the way that donors evaluate the projects that and programs that they develop to support decentralization. So in this case, as the government decided to create local governments out of what had basically been the mechanisms used in a donor project, you had this situation in which you were supporting a process, a system for empowering autonomous local governments with accountability mechanisms to their citizens. At a very low level, yes, but it had all of these basic elements of what we need in a decentralized system for good local governance. But as the donors were accepting that this was government policy and that it was working and they were pouring money into it, and they came up with multi-donor projects to support it, there were still issues with certain donors wanting to put their funds to certain purposes and so on and so forth, even though this was supposed to be a project to support the development of local autonomy and letting people make their own decisions. And even in the cases of some of the development partners who put their money into a more flexible basket fund, if you looked at the project document, for several of the projects that were developed along the course of the way here. They started, especially in the period when there became a bigger focus on outcomes and value for money, they started as evaluation criteria in the log frame, including things like number of kilometers of roads provided and things like this. Now this is, one understands why the development partners, which face their own incentives and constraints, have to think like this, but there is something incongruous about saying that you're providing funding to develop a system of decentralization and local governance to let people in a local government system make their own priorities, and then evaluating the performance of that project on whether they had the same priorities as the development partners who were funding the project. And I think this is something that development partners have to think about when they're developing these kinds of engagements with developing countries.